Alex sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table, a ghost in his own life. The dining room of his father-in-law's mansion was a cavern of opulence, dripping with crystal and smelling of old money and roasted duck. Across the vast expanse of wood, his wife, Clara, held court. She was radiant, her laughter a series of perfectly calibrated chimes designed to enchant the collection of banking executives and society doyens gathered for dinner. Alex felt the familiar weight of his own invisibility. He was an accessory, a curious piece of furniture Clara had acquired, one that didn't quite match the rest of the decor. He picked at his food, the clinking of his fork against the porcelain plate, sounding like a hammer blow in the brief lulls of conversation. Richard Thorne, his father-in-law, and the formidable patriarch of Thorne Industries, sat at the head of the table, a king on his throne. He regarded Alex with the same casual disdain he might reserve for an overcooked side dish. For 10 years, Alex had navigated this world of quiet dismissals and overt condescension. He had learned to shrink himself, to fold his edges inward until he took up as little space as possible. It was a survival mechanism he had perfected. Then Clara turned her brilliant, cold smile towards him. The conversation had drifted to talk of marriages, of advantageous pairings, and social mergers. "Oh, Alex is just so lucky he married me," she announced, her voice carrying across the table, clear as a bell. A few guests chuckled politely, unsure if it was a joke. Clara's eyes, however, held no humor. They were chips of ice. "I truly lifted him out of nothing," she continued, waving a dismissive hand. "His family had, well, they had good intentions, but not much else." The humiliation was a physical blow. It landed squarely in his chest, stealing the air from his lungs. He could feel the dozen pairs of eyes on him, a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He saw the smirk on Richard's face, a silent affirmation of his daughter's cruel words. Alex looked down at his plate, his reflection staring back from the glossy surface of the gravy. He said nothing. That was his role. To absorb, to endure, to be the silent, grateful recipient of a life he was constantly reminded he did not deserve. The conversation moved on, leaving him in the wreckage. But something inside him, a gear that had been rusted in place for a decade, finally shifted. It made a quiet, grating sound, a promise of movement. Later that night, the grand house was silent. The scent of expensive perfume and cigar smoke still lingered in the air, a phantom of the evening's casual cruelty. Clara was asleep, her breathing even and untroubled. She never wasted a moment's thought on the wounds she inflicted. Alex slipped out of their cavernous bedroom and went to his study. It was the one room in the house that felt like his, a small space filled with old books and the quiet dignity of his former life as a university archivist. He knelt before a locked cabinet, the key feeling cool and solid in his palm. Inside, beneath a stack of historical manuscripts, was a worn, leather-bound portfolio. He placed it on his desk, the old leather creaking like a church door. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside lay a stack of old stock certificates, printed on heavy paper with intricate borders, and a single, sealed envelope. The letter was from his grandfather, a man who had passed away just before Alex met Clara. His grandfather, Samuel, was a man Clara and her family dismissed as a simple, poor man, a man of good intentions, as Clara had so generously put it. Alex had never corrected them. He let them believe their version of the truth because in the beginning he had wanted their approval so desperately. He had wanted to belong. He ran his fingers over the embossed seals on the certificates. They were for a company he had never heard of. Orion Holdings. Tonight, for the first time, he felt the weight of the portfolio not as a memory, but as a weapon. Clara's words echoed in the silent room, lifted him out of nothing. A cold, clear resolve began to crystallize in his heart. He had been passive for too long. He had been sleeping. Now he was awake. The next morning, Alex called in sick to the library where he still volunteered twice a week, a last vestige of the life he'd had before Clara. He needed an excuse, a plausible reason to be in the city. He found the name of the law firm on his grandfather's letterhead, a discreet and ancient name etched in the city's financial district, Harrison and Sons. He made an appointment under a false name, a precaution that felt both thrilling and necessary. Walking into their offices was like stepping back in time. The air smelled of wood polish and old paper. Mr. Harrison was an elderly man with eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of generations. He looked at Alex over the top of his spectacles, his expression unreadable. "I was wondering when Samuel's grandson would finally visit," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He said you would come when the time was right?" Alex placed the portfolio on the immense desk between them. "I think," Alex said, his own voice sounding foreign to him, "the time is right." Mr. Harrison opened the portfolio with the reverence of a scholar examining a sacred text. He spent nearly an hour studying the documents, his silence filling the room. Alex sat perfectly still, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Finally, the old lawyer looked up. "Your grandfather was not a simple man, Alex," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "He was a ghost, a very, very wealthy ghost." The story that unfolded was a masterpiece of financial stealth. Samuel, a man who had presented himself to the world as a retired history teacher, had been a brilliant, silent investor. He despised the ostentatious displays of wealth he saw in the world and chose to live a life of quiet anonymity. "Orion Holdings," Mr. Harrison explained, was his masterpiece, a holding company with no public face, a labyrinth of trusts and shell corporations designed to be invisible. Over 60 years, Samuel had used Orion to acquire assets, to buy pieces of other companies, quietly, patiently, like a spider weaving a web that spanned the globe. "And these certificates?" Alex asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What are they?" "They represent the controlling interest in Orion," Mr. Harrison said. "They are now yours. The trust your grandfather established came under your full and sole control on your 35th birthday, last month." A dizzying sense of vertigo washed over Alex. He had been sitting on a fortune beyond comprehension, completely unaware. "There is more," Mr. Harrison said, leaning forward. "For the last 20 years, one of Orion's primary investment targets has been a mid-cap manufacturing firm. Your grandfather saw potential in it, but he deeply distrusted its leadership." He slid a file across the desk. He began buying shares quietly through intermediaries. He never wanted control, just a silent stake. But the company's leadership was reckless, and the stock price often dipped, making it an easy target for acquisition. Alex opened the file. The name on the top of the page made his blood run cold. Thorn Industries. "Orion Holdings," Mr. Harrison stated, his voice flat and final, "is the majority shareholder of Thorn Industries. It owns 51% of the company." The room tilted on its axis. 51%! He didn't just have money, he owned them. He owned the company that was the source of all their pride, their arrogance, their power. Richard Thorn, the king on his throne, was a tenant. And he, Alex, the ghost at the dinner table, was the landlord. The humiliation of the previous night, the sting of Clara's words, returned to him, but this time it was not a wound, it was fuel. A cold fire ignited within him, burning away a decade of passivity. He looked at Mr. Harrison, the resolve now set in his eyes like stone. "Richard and Clara," Alex said, "and they have no idea who Orion Holdings is, do they?" "None," the lawyer confirmed. "To them it is just a name on a shareholder report, a silent partner that has never once interfered with their operations." "Until now," Alex said. Life at home became a strange theatre. Alex played his part with renewed commitment, but now he was not the character, he was the director. He watched Clara and Richard with a new, terrifying clarity. He saw the brittle foundation of their confidence, the desperate need for validation that underpinned their cruelty. One evening, Clara tossed a new suit, still in its designer bag, onto the bed. "You're coming to the pre-gala charity luncheon with me on Friday," she announced. "And for heaven's sake, try to look like you belong. I can't have you embarrassing me in that old tweed jacket of yours." The old Alex would have flinched. The new Alex simply nodded. "Of course, dear," he said, his voice smooth and even. He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes at his easy compliance. She expected resistance, a mumbled protest. She did not know that he was no longer playing her game. He was designing a new one. Meanwhile, Richard Thorne was becoming increasingly agitated. He was in the middle of planning a ruthless, hostile takeover of a smaller competitor, a move that would cement his legacy. But a series of small, inexplicable roadblocks kept appearing. A line of credit was suddenly questioned by the bank. A key supplier unexpectedly reviewed their contract terms. These were minor annoyances, but they were cracks in the smooth facade of his authority. He paced his study at night, barking into his phone at underlings. Alex would sometimes pass the open door and see him, a powerful man suddenly looking small and besieged. Alex felt a chilling, satisfying sense of power. He was the source of Richard's anxiety, a silent, invisible force pulling the strings. He met with Mr. Harrison twice a week, absorbing decades of corporate law and financial strategy. The meek archivist was being reforged into a master tactician. The plan they developed was not a clumsy sledgehammer, it was a scalpel. "Richard has been using a series of offshore accounts to skim profits from the company for years," Mr. Harrison explained, pointing to a complex flowchart. "It's how he funds his and Clara's extravagant lifestyle beyond his official salary. It's highly illegal." "We start there," Alex decided, "but not directly." The first official move came from Orion Holdings. A legally binding letter was delivered to the board of Thorne Industries, invoking the majority shareholders' right to call for an immediate and comprehensive external audit. The letter was a bombshell. Richard received the news in his office, and his legendary composure finally cracked. He swept his desk clear in a fit of rage, sending papers and a crystal paperweight crashing to the floor. "Who are they?" he roared at his legal team over the speakerphone. "Who the hell is Orion Holdings?" But there were no answers, just a wall of impenetrable legal formality. That night, Richard and Clara came to the house for an impromptu dinner. The tension was palpable. Clara, for once, was not holding court. She looked worried, her perfect facade showing the faintest of cracks. "It's a power play, that's all it is," Richard blustered, pouring himself a large whiskey. "Some vulture fund trying to shake us down. They don't know who they're dealing with." Alex sat quietly, sipping his water. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thorne?" he asked, his voice laced with a carefully crafted innocence. Richard shot him a venomous look. "What would you know about it, Alex? This is the real world. A world of predators and prey. You wouldn't last a day." "I'm sure you'll handle it, Father," Clara said, her attempt at reassurance sounding thin and brittle. "Of course I will," Richard snapped. "I built this company from the ground up." It was a lie they had all told for so long that they believed it. In reality, Richard had inherited the company from his own father. Alex knew this. He knew everything. The auditors, hired by Mr. Harrison and loyal only to Orion, descended on Thorn Industries. They were quiet, efficient, and unstoppable. They requested access to everything, and Richard, legally bound by the shareholder directive, could not refuse. The cascade began. The auditors quickly flagged the offshore accounts. They froze them pending investigation. Suddenly, a significant portion of Richard's personal cash flow vanished. A credit card was declined at a restaurant. A payment for one of Clara's custom gowns bounced. These were small indignities, but they were the tremors before the earthquake. Clara was furious, her anger directed not at the true cause, but at the nearest, safest target. "What is going on, Alex?" she demanded one afternoon, throwing a bill onto the kitchen island. "The card for the caterer was rejected. It's mortifying." "I'm sure it's just a mistake," Alex said calmly, not looking up from his book. "A mistake? My father is under attack by some corporate raider, and now this. It's all falling apart." Yes, Alex thought. It is. The news of the audit and the frozen accounts leaked to the financial press. The headline was devastating. Thorn Industries under scrutiny from majority shareholder amidst fraud allegations. The company's stock price, which had been Richard's proudest metric, plummeted. It lost 30% of its value in a single day. Richard was a man cornered. He became frantic, making desperate calls to old allies who were now distancing themselves from the unfolding scandal. His power, which he had always believed was inherent to him, was revealed to be nothing more than a consensus of others. And that consensus was evaporating. The final piece of the plan was put into motion. Mr. Harrison, as the legal representative of Orion Holdings, sent a second official notice to the board. It called for an emergency board meeting. The agenda had only one item: a review of executive leadership and a vote on the immediate future of the chief executive officer. It was a declaration of war. The night before the board meeting, the house was as quiet as a tomb. Clara had gone to stay with her father, to offer what support she could. They were circling the wagons, a clan of two, against a world that was suddenly hostile. Alex walked through the silent, oversized rooms. He touched the expensive furniture, the silk curtains, the cold marble statues. It all felt like a museum exhibit, relics of a fallen dynasty. He felt no remorse. He felt no pity. He felt only the cold, clean satisfaction of justice. He thought of his grandfather, the quiet, unassuming man who had seen the rot at the heart of men like Richard Thorn. This was his grandfather's legacy. Not the money, but the power to restore balance, the power to teach a lesson that was long overdue. The day of the board meeting was grey and overcast, the sky a lid of steel over the city. Alex chose his suit with meticulous care. It was not the one Clara had bought for him. It was a custom-tailored piece he had purchased himself, a dark, charcoal grey that was understated but exuded an undeniable authority. It was his armour. He met Mr. Harrison in the lobby of the Thorn Industries Tower. The old lawyer gave him a single, approving nod. "Are you ready, Alex?" "I've been ready for 10 years, Alex replied. They took the private elevator to the top floor. The boardroom was a theatre of tension. The board members, a collection of grim-faced men and women, were seated around the long, imposing table. Richard Thorn sat at the head, his face a mask of exhausted fury. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. Clara was there, seated in a chair just behind her father. She was a non-voting member, present by virtue of her role as head of the company's charitable foundation. Her presence was meant to be a show of solidarity, a display of the Thorn family's unbreakable front. Her eyes, usually so full of arrogant fire, were shadowed with fear. When she saw Alex enter the room behind Mr. Harrison, she barely registered him. He was, as always, just part of the background. The meeting began with tense formalities. The company's general counsel, a nervous man named Jennings, read the agenda item aloud. The floor is now open for the representative of the majority shareholder, Orion Holdings, to address the board. Richard squared his shoulders, preparing for a fight with a faceless enemy. "Let's get this over with," he growled. Mr. Harrison stood up. "Orion Holdings thanks the board for convening on such short notice," he began, his voice calm and steady. "Our purpose today is not to engage in a protracted battle. It is to enact a necessary and immediate change in leadership." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "To that end, the owner of Orion Holdings has decided to address you directly." A murmur went through the room. The owner had always been a complete mystery. Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Who?" he demanded. "Who is it?" Mr. Harrison turned and gestured towards Alex. "Allow me to introduce you to the man who holds a 51% stake in this company," he said, "Mr. Alexander Croft." Time seemed to stop. Alex took a step forward, out of the shadows and into the center of the room. He looked directly at his wife, at his father-in-law. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of pure shock. He saw the confusion on the faces of the board members, the gears turning as they tried to process the impossible. Then he saw the look on Clara's face. It was a grotesque ballet of emotions: disbelief, confusion, dawning horror, and finally, sputtering rage. "Alex," she breathed, the name a strange foreign sound on her lips. Richard shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "What is this?" he bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. "What is the meaning of this farce? Jennings, get him out of here! Get this nobody out of my boardroom!" Alex didn't flinch. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards the head of the table. He placed his leather briefcase down, the soft click of the latches echoing in the stunned silence. "Your boardroom, Richard," Alex said, his voice quiet, but carrying an immense weight that no one in the room had ever heard from him before. "That's where you're mistaken. It hasn't been your boardroom for a very long time." He looked at Clara, his eyes as cold and clear as a winter sky. "You once said you lifted me out of nothing, Clara. You said I was lucky you married me." He let the memory of that humiliation hang in the air. "You spent 10 years treating me like an embarrassment. A charity case you were noble enough to take on. You and your father built your identities on the belief that you were superior, that your wealth and power were the result of your own brilliance." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the entire room before landing back on Richard. "But what you didn't know," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is that this company, your legacy, Clara's shopping allowance, the very roof over your head, it all existed because I allowed it to." He opened his briefcase and took out a single, heavy document. It was the master certificate of ownership for Orion Holdings bearing his name, Alexander Croft. He slid it across the polished table. It came to a stop directly in front of Richard Thorne. The patriarch stared at the paper as if it were a serpent. The truth, undeniable and devastating, was right in front of him. He was not a king, he was a court jester in a castle that belonged to the man he had mocked and dismissed for a decade. He sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him, leaving behind the empty husk of a broken man. His face was ashen, his breathing ragged. Clara, however, was not broken. She was incandescent with rage.
"Liar!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. "You're a liar! This is a trick! Father, do something!" But her father could do nothing. "It's all true, Clara," Alex said, his voice devoid of any emotion except a profound finality. "My grandfather was Samuel Croft. To you, he was just some poor old man. In reality, he was Orion Holdings. And now, I am." "You can't do this," she screamed, her carefully constructed composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. "You're nothing. You've always been nothing." "On the contrary," Alex said, turning to address the stunned board members, "I am the majority shareholder, and as my first act, I am calling for a vote. All those in favor of the immediate removal of Richard Thorne as Chief Executive Officer for reasons of gross financial misconduct, please raise your hand." He raised his own hand, slowly and deliberately. For a moment, no one moved.
Then, one by one, the other board members, men and women who valued survival above loyalty, raised their hands. They saw the undeniable shift in power. They saw the future. The vote was unanimous. "It's over, Richard," Alex said. The finality of it all finally broke through Clara's rage. A desperate, panicked sob escaped her lips. She rushed to her father, who sat staring blankly at the wall, a man unplugged from his own life. "Security," Alex said calmly to Mr. Jennings, "please escort Mr. Thorne and Miss Thorne from the premises." Two uniformed guards, who had been waiting discreetly outside, entered the room. Clara became hysterical as they approached. "You can't touch me! Do you know who I am?" she screamed, her words dissolving into incoherent sobs as the guards gently but firmly led her and her catatonic father out of the room. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving a profound silence in its wake. Alex stood at the head of the table, in the seat of power that was now rightfully his. He was no longer a ghost, he was the storm. The aftermath was swift and brutal. The evidence uncovered by the auditors was turned over to the authorities. Richard Thorne was arrested and charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, he pleaded guilty to avoid a drawn-out public trial. His sentence was 10 years in a federal prison. The king was dethroned and locked away in a cell. Clara's world disintegrated. Alex had filed for divorce the day after the board meeting. She had arrived at their first legal meeting with a team of aggressive lawyers, ready to fight for her share of the Thorne empire. It was then that Mr. Harrison produced the prenuptial agreement. It was the very document she had insisted upon 10 years earlier, designed to protect her family wealth from a man of no means. The irony was a cruel, poetic justice. The agreement stipulated that in the event of a divorce, each party would leave with only what they had brought into the marriage. Alex had brought his books and his grandfather's portfolio. Clara had brought her name and her father's money. With her father's assets frozen and his reputation destroyed, her name was now worthless. She was left with nothing. The society pages that had once chronicled her every triumph now detailed her spectacular fall from grace. Her friends abandoned her. The invitations stopped coming. She was forced to sell her jewelry and designer clothes just to afford the rent on a small, drab apartment on the other side of the city. She became the ghost, invisible to the world that had once adored her. Alex, in contrast, did not embrace the life of a typical corporate titan. He was voted in as the new chairman of the board of Thorne Industries, but his leadership was unlike anything the company had ever seen. He dismantled the toxic, high-pressure culture Richard had cultivated. He invested heavily in employee welfare and ethical business practices. He used the company's vast resources to fund projects that benefited the community, not just the shareholders. He sold the family mansion and most of the extravagant assets, liquidating the symbols of the Thorne dynasty's excess. He kept his small study's worth of books and moved into a comfortable but modest penthouse apartment overlooking the city park. He created the Samuel Croft Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to promoting literacy and preserving historical archives, a tribute to his grandfather and to the quiet, dignified life he had once led. He found purpose, not in the power or the money, but in using them to build something meaningful, something that would last. A year passed. The company, rebranded as Orion Industries, was more profitable and respected than ever before. Alex had found a new equilibrium, a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with his bank account. One sunny afternoon, he was visiting a local public library that his foundation had recently helped to refurbish. He walked through the aisles, the familiar smell of old paper and binding glue a comforting balm. He was no longer an archivist, but the heart of one still beat within him. He ran his hand along a row of classic novels, and his fingers brushed against someone else's. He turned to apologize and found himself looking into the warm, intelligent eyes of a woman with a kind smile. "Sorry about that," she said, laughing softly. "I get a little lost in here." Her name was Sarah. She was the head librarian. She had no idea who he was other than the anonymous benefactor from the Orion Foundation. They talked for over an hour, leaning against the bookshelves, discussing literature, history, and the quiet joy of a well-told story. He felt a connection, a simple, honest, human spark that had been absent from his life for so long. He asked her to coffee. She said yes. As he left the library and walked out into the warm afternoon sun, Alex felt a sense of profound peace. He had not sought revenge for its own sake. He had sought justice. He had sought the restoration of a moral order that had been corrupted by arrogance and greed. True power, he now understood, was not in the ability to command or to crush. It lay in the quiet strength to endure, the wisdom to know when to act, and the integrity to build a better world when the old one has been cleared away. True wealth was never measured in dollars or stock prices. It was measured in character. Those who built their lives on foundations of cruelty would always find their castles were made of sand, ready to be washed away by the tide, and sometimes that tide was a quiet man who simply loved books.